Hi everyone, welcome back. So today we are going to talk about a features that's already built into every domain controller, but honestly a lot of administrators don't think about it until they actually need. And it's called Directory Services Restore Mode or DSRM. Now imagine your domain controller has a serious problem. Maybe the Active Directory database is corrupted or you need to restore AD from a backup. You can't always fix those problems while Active Directory is running normally in your production environment. So that's where DSRM comes in. Think of it as an emergency recovery mode for your domain controller. But there is another side to this story as well. If the DSRM credential is not properly protected, it can also become a security risk. Okay. Now let's understand what is DSRM. So what exactly happens when you boot a domain controller into DSRM? The easiest way to understand it is to think about safe mode on a normal Windows server. But DSRM is specifically designed for domain controllers. When the DC start in DSRM, Active Directory Domain Services is not running. And that's actually the whole point. Because if the AD database itself has a problem, you don't necessarily want AD running while you are trying to repair or restore the database, right? For example, if I have a DC called DC01 and the Active Directory database on DC01 need to be restored from a backup, DSRM gives me an offline environment where I can perform that recovery operations. Okay, now let's understand, is DSRM is legacy features? You might be wondering, is this just an old Windows server features? Actually, no. DSRM has been part of Windows Server for many generations. And here's something interesting. If you have ever promoted a server to a domain controller, you have already seen the DSRM password screen. During DC promotion, Windows asks you to create a DSRM password. At that time, you might have thought, okay, another password I have to remember. But that password actually has a very specific purpose. It's your emergency recovery credentials for that domain controllers. Okay. Now let's talk about the password because this is where many people sometimes get confused. Your DSRM password is not the same thing as your domain admin password. DSRM uses the local administrator account of that domain controller. So let's say my domain controller is called DC01. Normally, I might log in using something like my domain name and then username like /administrator. But when I am in DSRM, I am dealing with the local administrator account of DC01. You can think about it like having an emergency key that's specific to that particular server. And just like an emergency key in the real world, you don't want it sitting somewhere where anyone can find it. Okay. Now let's understand how do we enter into DSRM mode. So how do we actually use DSRM? Traditionally, we restart the domain controller and enter the advanced boot options. From there, we select Directory Services Restore mode. Once the server start in DSRM, we log on using the local administrator account and the DSRM password. Notice something important here. We are not saying let me log in with my normal domain admin account. We are specifically using the DSRM credential. So if I am troubleshooting this is 01 and I need to work on the AD database while AD itself is offline, this is the account I would use. Okay. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what if I am working with server core? Or maybe I am managing the server remotely and pressing F8 is not practical. That's where BCD edit becomes useful. We can tell Windows that the next boot should be into directory services restore mode. The command is bcdedit slash set save boot DsRepair. Then we restart the server. Once we are finished with our maintenance, we remove that boot configurations and restart again so the server comes back normally. So in real production scenario, this is something you'd normally plan carefully because you are not intentionally taking a domain controller out of a normal AD services. Okay, so we have to take care of this. Okay, so what access does DSRM actually gives you? Now here is an important point. DSRM does not mean you have suddenly become a domain admin. You are working with a local domain controller environment while AD is offline. For example, suppose DC01 is one of three domain controller in my domain. If I boot DC01 into DSRM, I'm not taking the entire domain into DSRM. I'm only taking that particular DC into this recovery mode. The other domain controller can continue serving the domain, assuming they are healthy. That's one of the reason having multiple DCs is so important in production. Okay. Now let's talk about the security side. Imagine an organization's promoted a domain controller 5 years ago. During promotion, someone created the DSRM password, and after that, nobody ever changed it. 5 years later, that same credential is still sitting there. Now imagine an attacker somehow obtains that credential, and you have potentially given that attacker another powerful administrative credentials associated with a domain controller. And that's why DSRM should not be treated as like we said it during DC promotion, so we are done. No, it's need to be managed throughout the lifetime of the domain controller. Okay. Now let's understand the DSRM admin login behavior registry key. And this brings us to a setting that every AD security administrator should know about. It's called DSRM admin login behavior. This registry setting controls when the DSRM administrator account can be used. Normally, the DSRM account is intended for the purpose DSRM recovery scenario, but different values can change that behavior. And and the one I really want you to remember is value 2. Value 2 can allow the DSRM account to be used for network login. And think about the difference here. There is a big difference between an emergency recovery account that you can use while the DC is in DSRM and a credential that can potentially be used remotely over the network. So, from a security perspective, value 2 deserve immediate attention. It's become a dangerous. Okay. Now, how do we detect and defend? So, what should we actually do as administrator? First, check the value of DSRM admin login behavior. Second, monitor changes to the DSRM password. Windows provide event ID 4794 when the DSRM password is changed. So imagine you are reviewing your security logs and suddenly you see event ID 4794 on one of your domain controllers. That's something you should investigate. Who changed that password? Was it an approved maintenance activity or was it unexpected? And finally, make sure the DSRM password is rotated regularly rather than being forgotten after the initial DC promotions. Okay. Now let's understand how do we reset the DSRM password. You don't have to reboot the domain controller into DSRM just because you want to change the password. You can reset it using NTDS util. You go into NTDS util, enter the DSRM password context, and then reset the password. For example, if I am logged in onto DC01, I want to update a DSRM password, I can perform that operations from the normal Windows environment. So, from an operational perspective, there is really no good excuse for saying like we cannot rotate the DSRM password because we don't want to reboot the domain control. You don't need to reboot just to rotate the credentials, right? Now, let's quickly put everything together. So, DSRM is basically the emergency recovery mode for a domain controller. It allows administrator to work with Active Directory when AD itself need to be offline. It uses separate DSRM credentials associated with the local administrator account. We can boot into it using the advanced boot options or BCDEdit. And from a security perspective, we need to protect that credential just like we protect other privileged credential. Check DSRM admin login behavior, monitor event ID 4794, and make sure the DSRM password does not become a forgotten 5 years old credentials. Okay, and that's DSRM. It's great example of something we have in Active Directory for recovery, but that also need to be considered from a security perspective. If you are working with Active Directory and want more practical deep dives like this, let me know what topic you want to see next. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.